Let's walk through an illustration of a production cost report that actually has cost transferred in from a prior work in process account. So in this example, we have Claudia Carpet, who is manufacturing carpet in 7 different processes. We're only going to look at one of them, the dyeing department. And it tells us that when they dye the carpet, the dye is the direct material that will be added, and it is added at the beginning of the process. So materials, the dye, are added as soon as the process begins the conversion cycle. Now our conversion cost, remember the direct labor and overhead that we apply to those materials to convert them to a finished product, are incurred, as your problem says, evenly throughout the process. So it gives us the following information to work through and ask us to prepare a cost report. So just as we saw in your chapter, we had 55 units in beginning work in process. So these were units from the dyeing department, okay, that were in the dye department, in the dye process last period, but they were not finished. So they were left in work in process at the end of the prior period. So we have 55 units in beginning work in process, and it tells us that there were 560 rolls of carpet that were transferred into this department during the period. So we have 615 units to account for. Okay, so as we account for those 615 units, remember that there are 2 places they can go. They can be completed and transferred out to the next department, or they could remain in ending work in process. And our text tells us that they actually completed 490 rolls. So these 490 rolls were completed. If you subtract that from 615, we have 125 left in ending work in process. So now we've accounted for all of our units. The next step is to calculate the equivalent units of production. Well, let's start with the easiest. If we completed 490 units, okay, then they have all of their materials. That's the equivalent of finishing 490 units, and they have all their conversion costs. They are complete. And if you remember, the transferred in costs are always 100% complete. These transferred in costs or transferred in units, okay, include anything that anything that was brought in for this particular period. All right, so these transferred in, the 490, are complete, 100% complete, since they are being transferred out. But in the ending work in process, it tells us that we have 125 rolls. Okay, once again, for ending work in process, the 125 rolls are they're the same as 125 units for being transferred in. They have all their materials, so 125 times 100% is 125. But it tells us in the problem here that only 80% of the conversion is complete. So out of these 125 units, they only have 80% of the labor and overhead applied to them. So that is the equivalent, 125 times 80%, that is the equivalent of finishing 100 units. All right, so that's our primary goal in this part, is to determine the equivalent number of units. Okay, so of the 490 that we started and completed, they were 100% complete with the transferred in number. Ending work in process of 125, they're 100% complete. And so with materials, they have, obviously the completed units have all their materials, and those that are in work in process, they have all the dye they're going to need. But as far as conversion goes, the completed units have all their conversion costs. Those in work in process do not. They need another 20%. Right? So we should have already incurred 80% of the cost related to these particular items. That's what we are that is why we need to know the total number of units, so that we can allocate, as we see here, the total cost that are related to these particular units. All right, so we've got the number of units accounted for. Now we step down and try to determine what our total costs were in each of these areas: the transferred in, the material, and the conversion. Well, the book tells us that we had $3,500 in beginning work in process. It tells us over in our beginning work in process that we had $3,500 in beginning work in process for transferred in cost. So when the rugs were transferred in, this is what came with them. We had $1,750 worth of material already added to these rugs that are in work in process, and $5,420 already in these rugs for labor and overhead. But during the period, we added $13,010 of materials. We added $53,580. We see that here of labor and overhead. So what is this $18,025? Okay, remember it tells us that these costs were transferred in from the spinning department. So what we have started to start with are those beginning work in process costs and the cost that were transferred into this particular process. So our transferred in costs are $21,525, and we want to see these costs separately from the materials and labor and overhead that are about to occur, because basically management for the dye department really only wants to be held accountable for the material, labor, and overhead that they are adding to this product. And that's what we see in this particular situation. So once we know the total cost, we know the total costs that have taken place in this department, although we have some that were transferred in, we have the direct materials, we have the labor and the overhead. We have got a total of $95,285 to account for in this particular process. This includes all the costs that have come from prior processes. Keep that in mind. So now we want to determine the total cost per unit. We can't simply say 95,285 divided by 615 units, because we have some units that are not complete. 125 units to be precise. They are still in work in process. But they have incurred some of their costs, just not all of them. So that is why we calculated the equivalent units of the equivalent of completed units above. And we will use these numbers in our calculations here. If I know the total transferred in cost, I simply divide by the equivalent units of transferred in cost. 615. It gives me $35 per unit. If I know the total direct materials cost, and I divide it by the equivalent units, so remember we only have 490 units completed. We do have 125 units in work in process to make up the 615, but all 615 units, those that were complete and those that are still in work in process, have all of their materials. So in essence, they're 100% complete. So this is the equivalent of 615 completed units, because all of the costs for materials have already been incurred. So $14,760 divided by 615 tells me that we are spending $25 per rug in direct materials. Conversion cost, on the other hand, we have our total cost, and we're dividing by 590, not 615, because we have 490 finished units, but we've only incurred 80% of the cost for these 125. So we only want to consider them 80% complete. They are the equivalent of 100 completed units. So we divide by 590, which gives us $100 of conversion cost per unit. So when we add these three costs together, we know that it cost us basically $159 to complete the rug up through the end of this process. All right, so if we're going to complete these 490 rugs and transfer them to the next department or to finished goods, we have to know what cost needs to be transferred out. And we simply go back and look at our $35, excuse me here. Let me put that back in line for you. We have our $35 per unit that we've incurred and transferred in, and we multiply that times the 490 units that are complete. So 35 times 490 tells me the cost for my completed goods that have been transferred in. I will do the same thing with materials. I know that I transferred 490 units. I multiply those 490 units times the $24 per unit, and I get the $11,160. You can see here. We're simply taking the total number of units that have been transferred out of our department, and we're multiplying that by the total cost per unit. And that is generating for us the total costs that need to be transferred out either to the next department or to finished goods. Okay, so once again, the process is to account for all of your units, then to determine your number of equivalent units produced. Determine all of your cost for each department, for transferred in, for materials, for labor and overhead. And then we can calculate the cost per unit using the equivalent units of the equivalent of completed units as our divisor. Okay, so I wanted you to see one more example of this. You've seen two examples in the chapter video lectures. Now you've seen an illustration here. Use these as often as you need to practice. I'm going to give you some homework problems to practice on as well. We can skim down to see the journal entries related to these processes to kind of wrap it up. Once again, remember that the cost that came into the dye department, okay, came out of the spinning department. So once the spinning department was finished with the rugs, they transfer the $18,025 out of spinning and into dye. And then we add the raw materials. So we see raw materials coming out of raw materials inventory and into the work in process. We see wages coming into the dye department, and we see manufacturing overhead coming into the dye department. And we can tell by this journal entry that the dyeing process was not the last process, because in this journal entry we have transferred cost out of the dye department and into the plying department. So there is another process that's going to take place here. We can tell that simply by this journal entry. Okay, just one more example to help you walk through a production cost report and how we use these numbers to determine cost per unit and how to determine which costs get moved off of our balance sheet out of finished goods inventory and into cost of goods sold when that process ultimately takes place.